Hi, it's a pleasure to greet you and to welcome you to this webinar on climate action in Latin America and the Caribbean, organized by the Inter-American Development Bank. Welcome. We are really happy to be able to explore with you opportunities going forward when we speak of sustainability and climate change in our region. To begin, I'd like to give the floor to Rachel Moses, CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, an organization dedicated to turn the Caribbean into the first climately intelligent area in the world. Raquel, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me today. The Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator was formed to execute on a vision for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm so delighted to be here with you today to talk about just that, the vision for Latin America and the Caribbean. It is so important that we keep that in mind because there is so much that we need to do and very little time in which we have to execute it. Current geopolitical issues make it very, very clear that we all need to build our resilience and our internal networks in order to rely on each other and to protect ourselves from exogenous shocks. What we know now is that things that happen very far away impact us greatly. We're seeing it certainly in food prices, and we're seeing it in energy prices. All of the things that we're seeing now have been and were predicted. And so what we know is that we have to continue to press even harder to execute on this vision. The first thing that I want you to keep in mind is what this vision is. It's a Caribbean that's safe and secure, energy and food secure, and a beautiful place where we are living in harmony with nature. And that is the vision that we need to keep top of mind as we pursue our climate ambitions, because it isn't the fear of what will happen that we should try to avoid, but the promise of the future that we should work diligently towards. So I'll tell you the three things that we work on that are most important to us are energy, conservation, and growth. And we do those things in a number of different ways. And why it's important is because we see these as keystones in the vision that we seek to create. The first thing is energy. Energy independence is so important. As a region, we are currently on an average of about 17%. And while that is far above many other areas and many other locations, it's important for us to understand that energy independence for the Caribbean means even more because our fuel prices are so high and our costs are so high. So we don't have the economies of scale, which makes energy independence both an opportunity for us to grow and reduce our costs, as well as protecting ourselves from exogenous shocks. So in pursuing 90% renewable energy for all, what that allows us to do is to free up the cash flows because so much of our foreign exchange, up to 40%, is spent on fuels for the generation of electricity as well as for transportation. And we are hopeful to get the region to 90% renewable energy by 2040. And this is something that we absolutely need to work together and collectively to pursue. The next thing that we work on is conservation, protecting 30% of the land and 30% of the ocean by 2030. That's really important to give nature an opportunity to regenerate itself. Nature's fabulous at executing on this vision that we have in mind. We just need to give it the space to do that. And so what we've noticed in talking to countries across the region on the execution of this vision that we have is that there is no question about whether or not there is interest or excitement around protecting the land and the ocean. The challenge comes in the cost. And what we know is that there is money available to do these things, but how we structure these interventions make it really, really important in our ability to execute. The last thing that we do is the generation of new green jobs. And what we want to see is that we build our economic resilience on a future based opportunity versus building it on the past. We want to see tourism grow, but we want to see green jobs and green opportunities grow even more as an export from the region. And so when we look across the things that we consider important in executing on this vision for Latin America and the Caribbean, there is a project that we're working on right now for the integration of the energy market of the region. And we're so excited about that because it is both future proof as well as focusing on the things that we do really well, which is collaborate and cooperate. And so it will involve things like generating geothermal energy in Dominica and using that to create a link between Dominica and Trinidad and Tobago to then use that energy, that green energy, to develop green hydrogen as a regional export. And how exciting is that? It's a real moonshot for us, but it is something that will take years, if not decades, to complete. But if we don't start now, we miss the chance to get it done. The other project that we have that I'm really excited about, and I'm excited about all of our projects, but the other project that we have is a solar assembly facility, again being established in Trinidad and Tobago, that will allow us to export solar panels to the region, helping ourselves rather than just importing panels, helping ourselves deliver the energy independence that we would like to see. We have a climate smart agriculture project in Jamaica that is very, very exciting, where we are using at-risk youth to create indoor farms so that we can create produce. And working with the private sector, we have the ability to bring food security to the region. The excitement around that project has enabled us to attract many other countries who also want to collaborate on the issue of climate smart agriculture. And across all of those things, we see the intersection between energy security, creation of green jobs, and conservation. And that is why we are so grateful to the IDB for all of the support that they have provided us, both in our incubation as well as in our execution. I truly believe that they are partners in our execution of the ambition and the vision for Latin America and the Caribbean. We have to keep that vision in our minds, and we have to remember that we are working towards something good in as much as we are running away from something bad. The alternative is not an option. And oftentimes, when I speak to audiences, when we talk about the accomplishments at the Conference of the Parties or COP26, failure was not an option. We don't have the opportunity to fail at this. Everything that we have is at stake. But what's even more incredible is what we have to gain: harmony, health, wealth, success, future, and a future that is so wonderful and fulfilling that it is beyond our wildest imagination. And there are just a few things that we need to do to get that done. We need to stay steadfast. We need to work hard. We need to stay determined, and we cannot afford to waste any time. Time is against us, but the future is hopeful and brilliant and has so many things to offer us, and I cannot wait to see us get there. Thank you so much, IDB, for this opportunity, and I look forward to engaging with all of you soon.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for your viewpoint on the climate agenda. The energy sector and the use of the soil are key elements for transition to a zero emissions economy. Thank you so much. And now it's a real pleasure to invite a person that, aside from being a wonderful artist, has climate change in his DNA. He is the singer of the Maná group, and he's also part of the Selva Negra, who is on preservation and protection of biodiversity. Fer, welcome. It's such a pleasure to see you. Tell us, what's been your personal road towards sustainability and the results that have most opened your eyes to the importance of protecting the ecosystems like the forest of the Sierra of Aizcuco?
Well, thank you for inviting me to the panel. Greetings to all our good friends at the IDB. I'm here happy to answer Huizculco Sierra Forest. Well, the journey has been really beautiful for me as a child. I loved the animals and plants, and I recall a very fascinating story. I used to liberate the canaries from my grandmother's cages. Canaries are those little birds that are often in homes of people in cages. And so I had a tendency to want to liberate them anytime I could. So I felt that passion for the environment as a young child. Once joined Mana in 1992, we cut a record that was entitled Donde Jugarán los Niños? And there's a song that is beautiful in that record that is entitled Donde Jugarán los Niños? And it basically addresses this issue that we were going to have to deal with at that time if we didn't do something. And so throughout my career, this has been something that has affected me twofold. First, taking on a project such as anything related to turtles or trees or anything that could be done in trying to conserve the ecosystem. And the second was trying to inspire people to do the same, foster this type of activity. And what we wanted to do is infect people with this different attitude. We wanted to instill this love for the ecosystem that we all shared.
Fer, how do you see the importance of communities in achieving environmental projects? I know you've worked closely with the communities in your area.
Well, I think it's a really important point. There's a huge element related to inspiring in this case because you're trying to motivate people to help. We have to look at this from a global standpoint and then bring it down to the local level. And that's what we do with communities. We've been working with communities for a long time. We've been saving sea turtles on the Mexican Pacific coast. We have freed millions of turtles, and we need to be able to work with communities and get them involved, give them something to do. An important thing is that we need to make sure that they understand that we're not there to invade their territory, but rather we're trying to protect the planet for everybody's benefit. And when we talk about communities, we need to engage in a great deal of education. We need to create awareness for these issues. And I think that everything we've done, both on the sea turtle front, as well as other activities we've undertaken with the Ahuizculco, have helped a great deal. And we also provide resources to local communities, but they also take part in supporting everything that we do. So it's really a win-win proposition.
Fer, Selva Negra began in 1996. From your experience to date, how do you see the role of civil society organizations in climate action for the future? And what do you think they should focus on? I mean, other in organizations to have a greater impact?
Well, in our experience, we've been very fortunate to have been a well-known pop band in all of the Americas and the US. And that has been very helpful in us conveying this message to people, this message that highlights respecting our Mother Earth. Now, when you're an artist or a well-known band, you have a lot of resources available to you to be able to create outreach, to be able to communicate with others, to create social networks. It's a very powerful tool. And we always need to try to bring together different groups in society. It could be a small village, or it could be a city, or in your country. And that's something that I would recommend. And I would also share that it's important to get everybody involved, because the more people you have involved, the more weight, the more pressure you can apply to governments, and not just in Latin America. In Latin America, Vanessa, either governments don't understand the environment as it happens in my country, at least with some public officials, or they're not interested in that, or they're just basically corrupt. I'm just speaking from the heart here. So, in this regard, we need to support NGOs, the different civil society foundations, so that we can all build a better planet for our children, for our grandchildren. This planet, this home is on loan temporarily. Future generations will never forgive us if we don't do everything in our power to improve the situation. So, civil society organizations need to try and garner the largest amount of support possible for us to be able to get the support we need for these initiatives.
Fer, tell us a little about the work that you've done in the Sierra de Aizcuco with the IDB and the importance of reforestation.
Absolutely. The IDB has done wonderful work. I need to recognize that over the years that we've been working with you, we've been able to achieve many things. We've planted hundreds of thousands of trees thanks to the support we've received. This began in 2017. We went to New York with them and got commitments from a lot of different people. And I love the fact that the IDB gets involved in these projects. The truth is that the number one most urgent thing on the planet right now is global warming. So by planting trees and by changing the energy structure to alternative energies, and they really need to just be completely alternative. But the problem is that everybody has oil, and now they're trying to mess with us because they don't want to get rid of oil, because they make a lot of money on that. So they don't care about wind power. They don't care about solar power. So I think that we need to apply pressure on different fronts. It's key for us to engage extensively in environmental education, plant many, many trees, and try to make that transition to alternative energies as soon as possible.
And to end, Fer, what message would you like to leave us, those of us who are listening to you today?
Of course, Vanessa, first and foremost, I want to thank everybody who has joined us today. You are now agents of change. I believe with a full heart that we can make this change if we all work together. I want to thank all of the folks who helped us in our Mexican Pacific Coast project. I want to thank the IDB. I want to say that this can, in fact, be done. You are all now agents of change. And if we start working together, beginning today, we will achieve our purpose.
Muchísimas gracias, Fer. Siempre es un gusto escucharte y eres una verdadera
Thank you so much, Fer. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to hear the passion and the commitment with our planet Earth. Thank you so much. And now the time has come to exchange ideas, and I want to welcome the members of our panel. First, I'd like to welcome Andrea Mesa, who's Minister of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica. Welcome, Minister. Thank you so much, Vanessa. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to share with the panel. It's a real pleasure. Thank you. We want to greet Julio Cesar, General Coordinator of the National Association of the Indigenous People of the Colombian Amazonia, OPIAC, who represents 64 indigenous people. Welcome, Julio Cesar. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you. We also want to welcome Diana Quintero, who's the OPIAC advisor and coordinator of the Indie Fund. Welcome, Diana. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here here
También
today.
queremos
Thank
invitar
you.
a Caroline
We'd also like
Pichapruebo.
to
Ella
invite
es
Caroline
abogada
Di Prolo,
ambiental,
who is an
fundadora de
attorney,
INCLIMA.
environmental
Es una
attorney, founder
iniciativa
of CLIMA,
latinoamericana de
which is
abogados del
a Latin
clima por la
American
acción de
initiative of
movilización,
attorneys
y me
for
da
climate for
muchísimo
the
gusto
action of
tenerla con
mobilization.
nosotros.
And it's a
Welcome,
pleasure to
Carolina.
have her with us. Welcome,
Thank
Carolina.
you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Bueno, me gustaría empezar con usted,
I would
ministra
like to
Mesa.
begin with you,
Cuéntenos
Minister
por qué es
Mesa.
tan importante
Tell
para
us,
toda
why
la
is it
región
so important
avanzar
for
con
the
esta agenda
region to
climática
advance
y
with
qué
this
oportunidades
climate
hay.
agenda, and what opportunities
Lo
are there?
primero, Vanessa, es
Well, the
importante
first,
entender
Vanessa,
que esto no es
is
solo
that
un
it's
tema
important for us
ambiental,
to understand
sino que
that this
estamos
isn't
hablando
just
de
an
una
environmental
política
issue.
de
We're
cambiar nuestro
talking
modelo de
about
desarrollo.
a change in our
Latinoamérica es
development
de las
model.
regiones más
Latin
vulnerables
America
a
is
los
one of the
efectos del
most
cambio
vulnerable
climático.
regions to the effect
Tenemos
of climate change.
desigualdades,
We have
inequidades, una situación
inequalities,
muy compleja que se ha
differences.
visto
We have a
además
very complex
acrecentada
situation
por
which
el
has
COVID,
increased, in fact, with
pero
COVID.
al mismo tiempo
But
tenemos
at the
unas
same
riquezas
time,
enormes
we
en un
have
continente
enormous
muy
wealth. We
diverso,
have a
con una
mega
naturaleza
diverse
increíble
continent
que es
and
parte de la
incredible
solución a
nature,
esta
which is
apuesta a
part
la
of the
crisis
solution
climática,
to this
con
climate
una serie de
change. We
recursos,
have to
incluso
bet on the climate
minerales
change. And we
y
have a series of
litio, donde el
resources like
tema de la
mineral,
movilidad
lithium,
eléctrica va a ser fundamental.
electric
Y
mobility is going
donde
to be
sobre
something
todo tenemos
fundamental.
esa
And above
posibilidad
all,
de
we have
entender
the possibility
que
of
necesitamos llegar a ser
understanding
emisiones neto
that we
cero en el
need to do
2050 y
net
positivos con
zero
la
emissions in
naturaleza,
2050,
y
and we
que
have to be
en
positive
el
with nature.
continente tenemos
And in the
recursos
continent,
naturales que nos
we
permitan
have
avanzar
natural
ahí,
resources that would
producir
allow us to do
electricidad con
this, to
estas fuentes
produce
renovables.
electricity with the
Estamos
renewable
haciendo avances
energies. And
impresionantes,
we are
pero todavía
advancing,
queda un
but we
espacio
still have a
enorme para
lot to
seguir
do
avanzando en esa línea.
to continue
Tenemos
to
la
advance in
posibilidad
that
también
line.
de
We
entender a la
have also the
naturaleza
possibility of
como eso, como
understanding
parte de la
nature
solución,
as part of the
darle un eje
solution,
central,
to give it a
reconocer la
central
diversidad
access, to
cultural, y yo
recognize the
estoy
cultural
segura que ahora
diversity. And I'm
nuestros
sure
colegas de
that
OPIAC van a
now
hacer
our
y van a entrar
OPIAC
porque ellos
colleagues are
tienen esos
going to
saberes
do something
tradicionales
because they
también.
have the
Entonces, ¿qué
traditional
tenemos? Un
knowledge. And
continente
so what do
con
we have? We have
muchas de las
a continent with
posibilidades y de las
so many
soluciones
possibilities and so
donde
many
podemos
solutions
en esta
where
transición
we can,
entender que el
during this
planeta tiene
transition,
límites
understand that the
y que
planet has
podemos
its limitations
movernos en
and that
modelos de
we can
desarrollo
move
donde
in
rompemos las
development models,
inequidades,
breaking the
haciendo
inequities
transformaciones importantes,
with
podemos empezar a
important
generar más
transformations so that we
empleos
can begin to
verdes y
generate
azules.
more
Hay
green and
oportunidades
blue
enormes,
employments. There are
infraestructuras
enormous
claves que nos
opportunities.
llevan
There's
a
key
mejorar la
infrastructures
calidad de
that will
vida,
help us
tener
improve the
ciudades
quality of
centradas
life with
en las personas y no en los vehículos,
people-centered
mejor
cities and not
calidad del aire
vehicle-centered
y a
cities. We
parar
have to have
muchos de
better
los
air
procesos
quality,
acelerados de
and we have to
destrucción del
interrupt many of
planeta.
the accelerated processes where
Esto
we're
es de lo que
destroying
estamos
nature.
hablando
That's what we're talking
cuando
about
vemos esta
when
apuesta
we see
por
this
atender la crisis
betting
climática.
on
Entonces,
the
es
climate
romper y
crisis.
entender,
We have
vamos a
to
hacer algo
break, we
porque
have to
somos un
understand, we
continente
have to
muy
do
vulnerable
something
y hay
because we
regiones
are a
muy
very vulnerable
vulnerables y
continent and there
poblaciones
are
muy
very vulnerable
vulnerables, pero al
regions,
mismo
very
tiempo ver
vulnerable
sus
populations, but
oportunidades
we
de
also have
surgimiento
to recognize
para
the
lograr
opportunities we
acelerar,
have so
dinamizar
that we
nuestras
can
economías, entendiendo que nos
accelerate our
movemos
economies and
dentro de
understand
esos
that we're
grandes
moving
límites
within
planetarios y
those
que podemos
planet
hacer
limitations
apuestas para
and that
que
we
esto
can
sea mediante
bet
una
on this
transición
because we
justa,
can,
cómo
through a
generamos
fair
nuevas
transition,
habilidades de las personas
generate
para
new
entrar en estas
skills
cadenas de
so
valor
that we can
globales,
enter
cuando vemos
into
los
these
temas de
global
movilidad
value chains and
eléctrica, cómo
understand the
mejoramos nuestras
electromobilities
ciudades y
and
al final
improve our
yo creo que
cities.
la
In
mayoría de
the end,
nuestras urbes
I
son
think that
muy
most of
caóticas,
our
muy
cities are
desiguales y
chaotic,
esta es una
too much
apuesta que nos puede
traffic,
ayudar a
and that
mejorar
is
eso.
something that will
¿Cómo
help us
hacemos
improve it.
para
How
proteger
do we
esos grandes
protect
ecosistemas que
those
tenemos tan claves?
ecosystems that we
El
have that are
Amazonas, la
key,
biomasa,
the
nuestros
Amazon,
océanos,
the
y ahí
biomass, our
tenemos una
oceans?
riqueza inmensa.
We
Hay
have
que
an
darle
enormous
valor
wealth
a la
there.
naturaleza, hay
Let's
que darle valor a
value
ese
nature.
conocimiento
Let's
ancestral que tenemos
value
y a
the
estas fuentes
ancestral
ambientales.
knowledge that we have
Un
and the
dato
cultural
simplemente
diversity.
para verlo. En el caso
One simple
costarricense,
information in the case of Costa
recientemente
Rica,
hicimos un análisis
recently
económico y
we did an
cuál es el
economic
valor de ese
analysis
capital
of what
natural.
is the value of that
Representa más o
natural
menos el
capital, and it
23% de nuestro
represents close to
Producto Interno Bruto
23%
en
of our
2019.
GDP
O sea,
in
es clave
2019. So
entender
it's
que así
key
como estamos
that we
haciendo
understand that
inversiones en el capital
just like we
humano,
are investing
a
in
veces en
human
esa
capital
infraestructura dura,
and
tenemos que
sometimes in
invertir
the
también
hard
en la
infrastructure,
naturaleza y en
we
los
also have to
cuidadores
invest
locales.
in nature and in
Yo
those who
diría,
care for it.
esos son
I
parte de las
would say that that
potencialidades de
is
los
part of
mensajes
the potential,
críticos.
and that's
Verlo
the
como esos
critical message. We have to see it as an opportunity, and also we're betting on saving ourselves to live in healthier ecosystems with healthier economies, because it will be the only way. The COVID crisis was clearly showed us that everything is interconnected. We're talking about the systemic approach, and the only way to understand is that to have healthy economies, we need healthy ecosystems. And That's what we're talking about.
Absolutamente, ministra, y su país es un ejemplo
Minister,
de eso, ¿verdad?
absolutely. And your
Está
country is an example of that. The truth
liderando
is
no
that
solo en la región, sino
you're
también en el
leading not
mundo,
only
pero
the region,
¿qué le
but in
diría
the
a los otros
world.
países?
What
Si un
would you
país tan
tell the other
pequeñito como
countries
Costa Rica
if such a
sí
tiny
logró
country like
llegar a la
Costa
carrera
Rica was
cero y
able
está
to
generando
get
pues energía
zero
renovable? ¿Qué le diría a
net
esos
zero and
países
you're generating
donde no está
renewable
eso
energy? What would
afuera?
you tell the other countries? What message would you
Esto es
tell
una
them to
apuesta
say
al
that it
modelo de
can be done?
desarrollo que
That this is
enfrentamos,
betting
que
on the
es
development
poniendo a
model,
las
that we
personas y a la
understand that we have
naturaleza
to
en el
put the people
centro
and
de lo
nature
que
in the
queremos, que es
center
generar
of what we
bienestar
want,
y es entender que la
generating
economía ya no puede ser una
welfare,
economía lineal.
understanding that the
Vamos
economy
a un cambio de
can't be a
paradigma, esa
linear
economía
economy. We have to have a
circular.
change of
Y
paradigm.
esa es la
It's a
apuesta.
circular
Todos
economy.
estamos con
That's what we
muchísimos
have to bet
retos,
on.
porque al final
All of us
poner
have a lot of challenges
invierto
because
en
it's not,
reducir,
oh, if I
¿no?, los
invest in
índices de
reducing
pobreza
here
o
the
proteger la
poverty
naturaleza. No,
indexes
es
or
invertir en
protect
ambas
nature.
cosas.
No,
Y
no,
esto es lo
we have
que
to
va a
invest on
hacer
both
que
things.
esos
And
cambios
that's what's going to
sistémicos
make it
y esas
possible
apuestas
us to achieve these
internacionales
systemic
también
changes because in
generan
the end,
beneficios
it
económicos,
also
¿no?
offers
Hay que dejar
economic
ese
benefits as
paradigma en
well.
donde
We have
pensamos
to
que
forget that
hacer
paradigm where we think
estos
that
ajustes, estos
to
cambios
make these
por
adjustments or
proteger
these
nuestros
changes to
océanos, nuestros
protect our
bosques,
oceans or
por
our forests
entender que vamos a
or understand
descarbonizar las
that we're
economías
going
y
to
disminuir
decarbonize our
esa
economies
dependencia de los
and
combustibles
break that
fósiles es malo
dependence
para la
on the
economía.
fuel
Todo lo
fossils is
contrario,
poor for the
nos
economy?
genera
No,
muchas
on the contrary,
oportunidades
it generates
económicas
a
y al
lot of
mismo
economic
tiempo nos genera
opportunities and
bienestar,
at the same
que es de
time,
lo que se trata.
welfare, which is what it's all about.
Absolutamente. Y Costa Rica es el ejemplo
Absolutely.
perfecto,
And
como
Costa
dice,
Rica is the
tan
perfect
maravillosamente
example
con el
of
turismo
how you're
sustentable,
doing
que
it with
es apostarle
sustainable
a la
tourism, for
naturaleza.
example.
Muchísimas
It's
gracias,
betting
ministra,
on
por
nature. Thank
liderazgo
you very
de
much,
todo el trabajo
Minister, for
que
your
están
leadership
realizando.
and for all the work
Bueno,
that you're
ahora quiero
doing.
preguntarle a Julio
And now
César.
I'd like to
Usted
ask
es
Julio
coordinador de
Cesar.
esta importante
You're a
agrupación de
coordinator of
pueblos
this
indígenas.
important group
Cuéntenos
of
qué es
indigenous
la
people.
OPIAC
Tell
y
us a
cómo
little
ven el
what
rol de los pueblos
OPIAC is
indígenas
and what
como
how you see the
protectores
role of
de los
indigenous people as
territorios en el
protectors
proceso
of
de
the
conservación y
territory
restauración
in
de la
this
Amazonía.
process of preservation and restoring of Amazon,
La Organización
the
Nacional
Amazon
de los
region.
Pueblos
The
Indígenas de la
National
Amazonía
Organization of Indigenous
colombiana
People of Amazon
representa
in
a
Colombia represents
64 de los 115
64
pueblos
of the
que se han
115
identificado
indigenous
acá en
people
Colombia.
identified
De esos
here in Colombia,
64 pueblos,
of which
dos pueblos indígenas
two
están en
indigenous people
aislamiento
are
voluntario y bueno, toda una
in
política que
voluntary
se hizo desde la
isolation, and they
organización
have a
también para
policy in our
poder
organization
defender los derechos
to
de estos pueblos
defend the rights
indígenas
of these
que han
indigenous people
tomado la
who
decisión
have
de
made the
no ser
decision of
contactados.
not
Somos una
being
institución
contacted.
que a
We
diferencia
are
de
an
otras
institution that,
organizaciones
contrary to
que
other
trabajan por pueblos
organizations working
indígenas,
with
nosotros
indigenous
formamos
people,
parte de
form
las
part
estructuras
of the
representativas de los pueblos indígenas
representative
en lo que
structures
tiene
of
que ver
indigenous
con la
people
defensa
in what
de los
refers to
pueblos
the
indígenas en
defense
el orden
of
nacional y
indigenous
en el
people in the
orden
national order
internacional.
and
Nosotros
international order.
respetamos
We
y hacemos
respect
respetar los diferentes
and
convenios y
make everyone
tratados
respect the different treaties
internacionales y
and
constitución
international
política de
conventions, the
Colombia
political
y las
constitution of
leyes
Colombia,
presentando
and
siempre
the
la
laws that
palabra de
always
vida, la ley
promote
de origen,
the word
la
of
ley
law,
natural
the
de los
law of
pueblos
origin, the
indígenas
natural
de la
law of
Amazonía
indigenous people
colombiana.
of the Colombian
Somos
Amazon
pueblos
region.
amazónicos,
We are
queremos
Amazonic
decirle al
people.
mundo que
We
tenemos
want to
formas
tell
de
the
vida
world that we
distintas,
have
que
different
tenemos
forms of
formas de
life,
gobierno
that we have
distintas,
different
que
forms
uno
of
de los
government,
fuertes
that
nuestros
one of
es el
our
tema
strengths
espiritual
is the
y que
spiritual
comprendemos de
issue,
alguna u otra
and that we
forma de manera
understand
distinta la vida.
things differently
Desde la
and
creación y
life
por
differently.
siglos hemos
Since the
supervivido en
creation
nuestros
and for
territorios.
centuries we've survived in our
Entendemos que somos
territories,
parte
we
integral
understand that
de
we
la
are a
naturaleza.
part of
Nosotros no
nature.
somos dueños de la
We are
naturaleza.
not
Nuestros mayores,
owners
nuestros
of nature.
abuelos nos
Our
han dicho
elders, our
que al
grandparents, our
igual que
ancestors have
otros
told us
seres
that,
de la
like
naturaleza,
other beings
nosotros
in nature,
debemos
we
respetarnos
must
y hemos
respect
logrado como pueblos
ourselves.
indígenas
And we, as
amazónicos
indigenous
ese
people in the
equilibrio
Amazon,
que
have
debe
managed
haber
to achieve
entre el
that
hombre
balance that we
y la
have to have
naturaleza.
between man and
Somos el
nature.
complemento
We are a
esencial de ella y
essential
formamos
complement,
parte
and we
holística de
form
ella.
part,
Con base
holistic
en
part
nuestras
of it,
leyes de origen,
based on our
las cuales han
laws
sido
of origin,
compartidas a
which
través
have
de
been shared
generaciones,
through
hemos
generations.
decidido
We
respetar el
have
mandato
decided
y
to respect the
proteger todo lo que
mandate and
existe
protect
en la
everything there
naturaleza.
is
Es nuestra
in nature.
riqueza como
It
pueblo.
is our wealth
El
as people.
suelo, el
The
subsuelo,
soil, the
el aire,
subsoil,
los
air,
animales, las piedras,
the
las
animals,
plantas
the
sagradas
stones, the
pero aquí
plants, they're they're all sacred.
iniciativa que
But
venga
here,
para
any
poder
initiative that
defender
comes
la naturaleza, para
to
combatir
defend
el cambio
nature, to
climático,
fight against
para
climate change,
evitar la
to
deforestación,
avoid
debe ser
deforestation,
siempre en
must
acciones
always
que
be
traten de
with
manera integral
actions that
no
treat
solamente a las
everything
plantas, a los
in an
animales,
integral
sino
way, not
también
only
que
plants
se
and
entienda
animals,
que hay
but
pueblos indígenas que
understanding
hay
that there
allí
are
que han venido
indigenous people
haciendo
living
el
there
trabajo.
who have been doing all that work.
Finalmente, y
And
para darle
finally,
paso a
to
Diana que explicará
allow
ya
Diana
más
to explain
técnicamente la propuesta que
in
venimos
more
trabajando
technical
nosotros como
details our proposal
pueblos indígenas.
as
Nosotros
Indigenous
somos
people, we are
esa organización que quiere
an organization that
presentar el proyecto del Fondo
wants to
Indio.
present the project of
Es
the
un primer fondo capitalizado
The
por la
Indie project. It
valorización
is
de los
capitalized
territorios
by the
indígenas,
valuing
el
of
cual
indigenous
nos
people,
ayudará a nosotros, a
which
los
will
indígenas de
help
la Amazonía
us,
colombiana,
indigenous people of
a
the
superar
Colombian
las
Amazon region,
condiciones
to
históricas
overcome
de
the
pobreza y de
historical
exclusión.
conditions of
Esto a
poverty
pesar
and
de ser los
exclusion.
pueblos y comunidades indígenas los
Despite the
principales
fact that we,
protectores y
as indigenous
defensores
people, are the
de
ones that
cerca de
mainly
26
protect and
millones de
defend close
hectáreas
to 26 million
vinculadas en los
hectares
territorios amazónicos
in the
que más ricos
Amazon
en biodiversidad
territory, which
y
are the
reservas de
richest in
carbono
biodiversity
tenemos.
and carbon
Amazonía
reserves in the
viva,
country.
humanidad
The
segura.
Amazon life Amazon,
Muchísimas
save
gracias. Tiene
mankind.
absolutamente toda
Thank
la
you very
razón.
much.
Está
And you are
comprobado que en los
completely
territorios
right. And
donde
it's been
habita
proven that
pueblos
in those
indígenas,
places where
pues
the indigenous
hay menos
people live,
deforestación y las zonas
there's
están más
less
protegidas.
deforestation and the areas are
Tienen
more
una
protected.
sabiduría
You
ancestral
have
de la cual
an
nosotros podemos
ancestral
aprender
knowledge that
muchísimo.
we can
Le agradezco
learn
mucho
so
por
much
su
from.
trabajo.
Thank you very
Bueno,
much for
ustedes
your
también
work.
son reconocidos por su
And you are
innovación en este
also
campo. Y quiero
recognized
pedirle a
for your
Diana que nos cuente
innovations in
sobre
this
el
field. So
fondo
I'd like
Indie,
to ask Diana to
cómo
tell us
ese
about the
modelo
Indie
de
Fund
financiación y
and what is the
empoderamiento para los
financing
pueblos para
model and the
fortalecer su
empowering
rol
of
de
the people to
guardianes de la
strengthen their
Amazonía.
role
Adelante,
as
Diana.
guardians of the Amazon.
Bueno, lo que ven ustedes en este momento en pantalla
Well, what you see on
corresponde
the screen right
al
now
territorio nacional
is
colombiano.
the National
Algunas de
Colombian
esas
Territory.
partes que ven
Some
ahí
of the
amarillas o
parts you see
naranjas
there in yellow
corresponden a
or
los
in
territorios
orange
indígenas
are
que
the
están
indigenous
bajo título
territories that are under
de
the title
reservas o de
of
resguardos indígenas.
reserves,
Como se dan
reservations,
cuenta,
or
la parte sur del
protection
país, que
areas. As
realmente
you
es
see
la
in the southern
parte que
part of the
colinda con
country, which is
toda
really the part that
la biomasa
is bordering with all the biomass
amazónica, pues es la parte donde
of the
están
Amazon
asentadas la
region,
mayoría de los
is
pueblos
where
indígenas
you
del
find
país y las
most of
personas con
the
las que
indigenous
más
people of our
riqueza
country. And those are the
cultural,
ones that have the
espiritual,
greatest cultural or
en
spiritual
materia de
wealth
biodiversidad,
and greater
reservas de carbono,
biodiversity,
yacimientos de
carbon
agua, pues los
reserve,
concentra
water
el
reservoirs.
país. Hay que
That's where
decir
it's mostly found in our country.
que la
And
apuesta
we
de
can say
los,
that
pues, de los
the
pueblos indígenas en este marco es
heading of
clave.
the
Innovar en el
indigenous
sentido
people
de que
here
la
is to
primera vez
innovate,
que
yes,
los pueblos indígenas toman
because it's the
la
first time that
vocería y
indigenous
dicen,
people have
yo quiero
become the
hacer algo,
spokesman
pero
and
quiero que
say,
ustedes, por
I want
favor,
to do
se
some,
den
but I
cuenta
want
que también
you
nosotros
to realize that
gestionamos y que
we
tenemos un
can also
sistema
manage,
de
that we have
ordenamiento territorial
a
que no es
territorial ordering
reconocido
system
y que no es
that is
valorado
not
de
being
la misma manera
recognized or
y que se
valued
puedan canalizar
similarly,
algunos de
and
los
that they
recursos
can
que hoy
channel
tienen en el
some of the
territorio,
resources that are
pues
being moved
en la
today
esfera global para que
in
ellos
the
puedan
global
seguir
sphere so that
manteniendo
they can
sus
continue to
condiciones
maintain
y por
their
supuesto
current
también
conditions
superando
and, of course,
otras tantas que les
overcome
impiden
so many
mantenerse
things that
como los
prevent them
pueblos
from
originarios en estos territorios.
remain
Hay que
as
decir
the
entonces
original
que
people
cuál es la
in these
apuesta,
territories.
o
So
por qué hablamos de un
we have
fondo
to say, what
indie,
are we
por
doing?
qué se
What are we
hablan
talking about
de
this indie
tokens.
fund? What are we talking about
De
the
manera, digamos
tokens?
que un poco,
Well,
si se quiere, explicativa, pedagógica,
to
imagínense ustedes que
explain,
ese
imagine
territorio, esas partes
that
en naranja,
territory, those sections
realmente
in
nosotros lo que
orange.
vamos a hacer es convertirlas
What we're going to do is
en
to
unas
turn
pequeñas
them
secciones, que es lo que hemos
into
denominado
small
tokens o
sections that
celdas,
we've called
y
tokens or
ese
cells. And
pedacito de tierra pues tiene una
those
historia
little
que contar.
pieces of
Y
land
esa
will have
historia
a
que
history to
contar,
tell,
la idea es
and that history
poderla
they tell
colocar en una
will be
plataforma de
placed in
intercambio financiero y por eso
a
hablamos de
platform for
tokens
financial exchange. That way we
no
speak of
fungibles
tokens,
y fungibles que ustedes
non-fungible
pueden
or
entrar
fungible,
al
so that
mercado.
they can
Entonces, esa
be in the
sigla
market as well.
hexagonal,
So
que es
that
el
little
componente
hexagonal
de
square that will
historia y
have
de
a
cuento, que
historical
evidentemente
component, it'll
cada
have its
porción de tierra
tales
va a
and
ser
stories.
única, es
And each
registro
little
único. ¿Por
portion
qué?
of land is
Porque
going to be
las
unique. It's going to be a
características
unique
geográficas de los
register
territorios son
because the
distintos. Estamos
geographic
hablando que
characteristics
en
of these
estas
territories are all
27 millones de
different.
hectáreas
We're
calculadas
saying
en
that in
área
these
colombiana,
27
pues
million
están
hectares
64
approximately in the
pueblos
Colombian
indígenas,
Amazon area,
64
there are 64
leyes de origen
indigenous
distinto,
people
64 historias que
with different
documentar y
laws, with
frente a
different
eso la idea es
histories
poder
or
registrar
stories to
y
tell.
acompañar
And
estos
the idea
procesos.
is to
Entonces,
record
una
all
vez se
that and
genera ese
support all these
proceso,
processes. So once
ese
this
token,
project
subirlo a una
or
plataforma
tokens
de
process takes place, we're
intercambio,
going to put it on a platform for
donde pues
exchange
evidentemente las
where
personas puedan mostrar
the
y puedan
people will
contar
be
qué
able
está pasando.
to
Ustedes
tell
solamente
their
de manera,
story.
digamos que
All you
gráficamente
have
vamos
to
a estar
do
viendo qué pasa
is
acá.
graphically now
Tenemos un
see What would happen if we take a little piece of that land and use it as a token, as an example, let's say 231. So if you realize in 1985, it had some conditions of forestation, It was supporting all the resources that were there, and yet in a degradation process begins then, and by 2009, you see this, that we had preserved initially is now almost barely non-existent. So what we hope to do is to support the indigenous people in their whole process of restoration, preservation, protection, defense of their territories, with the idea of being able to offer this to the people, anyone, you who are here listening us today, and those who are part of the panel can go and buy one of these tokens. And instead of giving your son or your wife or your friend a gift or a card, you can give them a token. And that token will allow him to be closer to what's happening in these territories, to support the autonomy and self-government processes and the governance of the indigenous people, supporting those processes in the different plans for preservation or restoration of that territory, but amongst other things, to come closer to the different processes that the whole planet needs in this climate change and in this climate crisis that we're living today, where all of us must contribute. The indigenous people historically have had their voices going through intermediaries. And today, the indigenous people, in the case of the OPIAC organization and the Colombian Amazon region, we are offering our knowledge, which are not private. They should be placed to serve mankind. Thank you very much, Diana. That was very important. And the impact of the financial innovation is amazing and what it can generate. This is a tremendous example that could be easily followed by other organizations, companies, and countries. Thank you for that innovation and for sharing it with us.
You're an attorney that specializes in environmental and climate change law, as well as the founder of La Clima, Latin American Climate Lawyers Initiative for Mobilizing Action. Could you please share with us what are the main environment conditions you foresee as adamant to ensure that the Latin region continues to build ambitious and concrete climate agenda?
Thank you, Vanessa. There is a huge potential for Latin American countries to take on a leadership role in promoting a model for a low carbon economy. We know that developing countries face normally lower costs in decarbonizing their economies. And in the case of the Latin American countries, we have abundant natural resources that are important assets in this new low carbon economy. So we have abundant wind and sun that can generate electricity. We have forests that need to be conserved to maintain carbon stocks in the ground, and also not only to ensure that we will maintain global temperatures, but that we also will maintain the microclimate conditions that are very important for local communities, and also forests that are important to grant access to water resources and to biodiversity. And speaking about biodiversity, there is a whole economy around the possibility to develop those unique goods that can be produced in our rainforests, biodiversity, for instance. But I think to promote this economy, Latin American countries should really put in place the proper public policies that can enhance conservation and recovery of our rainforests, and also that can foster climate finance in the region, including the policies that can enable Latin American countries to participate in those international carbon markets that are being designed. But this would include not only enacting the proper climate change national policy that we assume most countries already have, and sometimes they might need to be perfected, and that's very important as well, but also to take a further step in devising a carbon pricing strategy, and including perhaps to enact some regulation to create the infrastructure and the conditions for the development of those carbon projects and those projects that can deliver on mitigation outcomes, including in terms of protecting our rainforests. And also, of course, we can rely on regulation that can create the enabling environment to attract more climate finance, more foreign investment to climate change mitigation in Latin American countries. Of course, private actors and financial institutions included can also provide, can play a role in this process by providing the initial nudge for this process to take place in Latin America, as I think it's already happening. But we might need to take even bolder actions to accelerate this process, both from a public policy as from a private sector perspectives.
You're absolutely right, Caroline. Soft measures are as critical as the investment required to ensure we keep paving green pathways for sustainable development in our region. Thank you so much. Bueno, estamos en un momento clave de nuestra historia donde básicamente podemos
It's a key point in our history. We can either stay on the current path and deal with the worst effects of climate change, or bring about a change to create a sustainable world that is healthy and inclusive, and in which we all enjoy the same opportunities. And our panelists are already working to create this world for all. This is why I would like to invite you so that each one of you can give us a final message for our audience. Minister Mesa first, please. Thank you, Vanessa. It's been truly inspiring. I very much agree with what the panelists have stated. At the end of the day, it's a public policy bet for the long term in order to create enabling conditions to attract foreign direct investment, especially, and this is the key takeaway, since we are looking at systemic changes in this decisive decade. And the science tells us that the window of opportunity is closing, but we still have a window, and we have the knowledge and we have the finance that is out there. What we need is all of us together to act as part of the systemic change, with grassroots organizations, civil society, local governments, national governments, the private sector, all together need to work to achieve the goals, the zero emissions goal by 2050. The knowledge is there, the heritage is there in terms of our cultural richness in biodiversity, and it's about the political willingness and the readiness to advance, to find common ground and consensus. The goal is there, so we need to get down to work and do so quickly. That is key. Absolutely, Madam Minister. Climate change concerns us all, and we need all to deal with it. Julio Cesar, please. Yes, our message is that indigenous peoples should be allowed to be part of the solutions being presented for climate change. We have a lot to contribute: knowledge, science, customs, our laws. We, as stewards and historical guardians of our Amazon lands, also want to contribute in terms of the solutions that are required for the benefit of humanity.
we are here willing to come up with solutions, seeking to coordinate with governments, starting by the Colombian government, but also other governments around the world. And of course, we would then like to have direct contacts so we can present the initiatives we have as indigenous peoples. That is very important. Thank you very much, Julio Cesar. Diana? I would like to take the opportunity to say that the fund, the ED fund, and in this regard, it is important for the indigenous peoples to be able to take action in their own hands. And with regard to territory, the idea is not to relinquish ownership. The idea is to work in harmony with nature as well. We all wish to contribute through actions that contribute to mitigation and prevent deforestation. And this also includes all of the actions we undertake in terms of what we consider conducive to development, since humanity has very much contributed to the degradation of territory, land, and ecosystems. But we must also be able to recognize that there are other ways to manage land and the environment, as is the case with the indigenous peoples and certain local communities. And we are called upon to preserve such expertise and knowledge. Many of our indigenous peoples are at risk today. They face the risk of being forgotten, and we need to create process for autonomy and strengthening of capacities. We need to strengthen the capacities of governments and institutions globally, but we also need to do this with grassroots organizations. I think that is important too. Certainly, that is very important. Thank you, Diana. Carolini?
Well, I think we are running out of time. The climate change is already taking place. And of course, as time goes by, also we are losing our rainforests and our natural resources that are essential to fight climate change and to enable the transition to this new low carbon economy. And I think Latin America plays a key role in this process. So we really need to move fast from talks to action, to more meaningful investments, and of course to actual policies and laws and regulations that can help deliver on our climate challenges.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, our panel ends here. I would like to thank each and every one of our guests very much, first for the work they do, for their effort and the passion they put into protecting our planet. And of course, thank you for joining us. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. And to close our meeting today, I am honored to invite Dick Stern, who is a professor of economics and government and the president of the Independent Climate Change Institute at the London School of Economics.
Thank you so much for inviting me to close the session on climate vision for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I look forward very much to working with the current president, Mauricio Clavier-Corone, in the coming years. The IDB is grappling with the biggest problem of our time, the challenge of finding sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development, particularly in relation to climate change and biodiversity. But it is fundamentally a development story, and that's what I want to be clear about from the beginning. Let me start with where we are, and one way of summarizing where we are and where we have to go is COP26 of the UNFCCC in Glasgow in November of last year. It was a remarkable event. It was devoted to the implementation of the Paris Agreement of COP21 of 2015. It was there to ask the question, how can we deliver on our targets of well below 2 degrees and indeed best efforts to 1.5 degrees centigrade. At that COP, Net zero was prominent in a way that it was not before. Remember, we have to go to net zero to stabilize emissions, to stabilize concentrations. We have to stabilize concentrations to stabilize temperatures. The earlier we go to net zero, the lower the temperature at which we stabilize. So it was very clear at COP26 that we have to be at net zero by mid-century as a world if we're to be able to have a chance of stabilizing at 1.5. And it was also very clear that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees was very big. It would mean a huge increase in the proportion of the world's population, for example, exposed to severe heat at least once in every 5 years. In Latin America, of course, it would make a big difference to the severity of the hurricanes, to the stability of the Amazon forest, which is so fundamental to the health of and well-being of Latin America, to desertification, to loss of the snow from the Andes and so on. This is a story where Latin America is amongst the most vulnerable places in the world to climate change. And that realization of the big difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees was a crucial part of the story of Glasgow. Looking forward from Glasgow, I think there was a big understanding of the huge growth opportunities that there now lie in doing things differently. This is not a story of having to suffer on the standard of living front in order to limit the damage to the environment. If we do this well, if we invest in the right way, then we give ourselves the new growth story of the 21st century, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. But there was a realization not only of that opportunity, but that we have to invest strongly to get there. Within that investment story, this was the first COP, and I've been to them all since 2006. This was the first COP where the private sector was at center stage, talking strongly and clearly about this investment opportunity. We also realized still more clearly at this COP of the importance of adaptation and resilience. There'll be a lot of climate change. We've already seen a lot of climate change. There is more coming, and we're going to have to adapt to a more difficult environment in terms, of hurricanes, of desertification, of floods, and so on. And we have to think ahead and build our infrastructure in particular so it's resilient to what is coming. And also, and finally, around COP26, there was a very clear understanding, much clearer than in the past, of the importance of natural capital, of looking after our soils and our forests and our oceans. And that, I think, is something that was much clearer this time in the COP than we'd seen before. And again, an area of enormous relevance to Latin America and the Caribbean. Since the COP in November, we have, of course, had the terrible war in Ukraine. And that has focused the world, first and foremost, of course, on the human tragedy, but also, and importantly, on the challenge of energy security. And we see now that those things that we need to do to move away, in other words, to move away from fossil fuels from the perspective of climate and biodiversity, are also the things that we have to do from the point of view of energy security. In Europe, for example, of course, particularly close to this terrible war, you have seen a coming together of the countries of Europe and the European Union as a whole around a redoubling of efforts to move away from fossil fuel. Of course, there'll be short-term adjustments in this next 2 or 3 years just to get through. But in that context, there's a very strong move, rightly so, to push harder and stronger and more quickly in the direction of moving away from fossil fuels. Let us also recognize that this growth story, this new growth story, is one where poverty reduction is at center stage. The new way of doing things, the renewables and so on, offer great job opportunities, good jobs. The process of discovery and innovation will create all kinds of new activities. Public transport, for example, is an area where poor people benefit particularly, and it's very important for reducing emissions, for resilience, and for development as a whole. Restoring degraded land, looking after our soils much better, also very good for the opportunities of poor people. Opportunities around the forests, again, are very important for poor people. So what we see, and most modeling, I won't go into the details, but most modeling activities underline this, that this story, this new story of growth, is also the story of poverty reduction and inclusivity. And we must remember that if we fail to tackle climate change, then the consequences of that failure will be particularly hard for poorer people. Climate action and poverty reduction are two sides of the same coin. Let me turn briefly to opportunities for Latin America in this new situation that we find ourselves in, not only the climate crisis, but the energy crisis associated with the conflict in Ukraine. We are now moving into a period of rising commodity prices. This will benefit Latin America, which is particularly focused on commodities. It's extremely important that those extra revenues go to this new form of investment, the sustainable investment that will drive this new form of growth. Latin America is a part of the world where the costs of renewables are particularly low. Renewable electricity for 3 cents per kilowatt hour or less in Latin America, amongst the lowest costs in the world. So this world where we will be moving much more strongly away from fossil fuels towards renewable is a world in which Latin America has comparative advantage. More and more people will recognize that net zero requires a lot of negative emissions, and a lot of those negative emissions are associated with natural capital, restoring degraded land, looking after our forests much better, and so on. And that again is an area where Latin America has a comparative advantage. And there's also a comparative advantage in this new approach in the capital markets. The private sector has declared very strongly for net zero. At COP26 in Glasgow, 130 trillion of assets under management were declared for net zero by those managing those assets. Much of that investment will have to be in the emerging markets and developing economies. That is where most of the action will be. It's where the growth will be, and therefore it will be the places where we have to see if that growth, and we show that that growth can be combined with reduced emissions and indeed greater resilience at the same time. Much of those assets under management are associated, of course, with savings in the big international the savings and the big private institutions in rich countries. And they will go where they know before they go where they don't know. And it is a fact that they do know the markets in Latin America rather better than they know the markets in other parts of the world. So for all those reasons, there's a real comparative advantage in this new form of growth, this new form of investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me close by saying something about finance for this investment and the role of the multilateral development banks, including, of course, centrally, the IADB. If you look at the numbers of necessary investment, focusing on mitigation, adaptation, add something to this. But if you focus on mitigation, the emerging markets and developing countries, excluding China, are going to have to be investing around $2 trillion a year more in 2030. That is development investment. It's investment in the new form of growth. It's investment in infrastructure, which would, in any case, whatever your view of climate, been part of that growth story. But the challenge, of course, is now to make that investment clean and sustainable. We will not reach our goals on climate without that kind of investment, as I've emphasized, developed investment. If that development does not materialize, if that investment does not materialize, we'll have failed on development and at the same time we'll have failed on climate, both adaptation and mitigation. So if you think about those numbers, an extra $2 trillion a year of investment over and above what we've been seeing in the past to drive development, sustainable development forward, perhaps 1 trillion in emerging markets and developing countries could be internal and 1 trillion external. I'm deliberately speaking in broad round numbers, but in order to establish magnitude. An extra 1 trillion of external finance will be, by 2030 per annum, will be largely private sector. But that private sector will not be realized unless the public funds from development banks, and particularly the multilateral development banks, are there to help reduce, share, and manage risk. That will mean that the multilateral development banks will have to be offering finance 2 or 3 or 4 times during this decade higher than they have in the past to get to the hundreds of billions that will be necessary to help mobilize the private sector in the context of the magnitudes I've described. They have an absolutely central role to play, not only in scaling up the finance, but also in creating the conditions for investment, creating the conditions where there's reasonable confidence in the flow of revenues, reasonable confidence in the management of costs. We call that investment climate or country platforms, where private sector, public sector, the community get together to set out what they have in mind and to think about how it can be delivered. The MDBs have a central role in that process. So this decade is critical for the world if it's to make the new investments we need to make. And the MDBs have a critical role to play in this decade. They have to scale up. They have to move strongly in the directions that I've described. And I'm fully confident that the IADB will play an absolutely central role in that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Stern. Your concern and vision must be at the center of the public debate. The transition to a green economy is an imperative, and we have the instruments and the resources to move forward with this agenda. Thank you so much for your work and for your contributions. Bueno, aquí llegamos al final. Muchísimas gracias por habernos
This concludes our seminar. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope the conversation has been very interesting. Climate action is a key pillar of sustainable recovery in our region. This is why we wanted to provide some inspiring examples today. Our webinar will be available on the IDB webpage, and I would like to invite you to share it with everyone. Together, we can make a huge difference. We have everything that it takes, and I think we've heard this again and again through our guests. We have the resources, we have the knowledge, but more importantly, we have the determination of people to make a change and to create a sustainable world that is healthy and inclusive and that offers the same opportunities to all. It's been an honor for me to be able to be with you. Have a great afternoon.